afternoon, everyone. My name is Mag, and I'm a researcher at the Research Center on Anthropology and Health. And it is my pleasure today to present our second Anthropocene Research Lab distinguished lecture with Professor Jason W. Moore. Those of you who were here on Monday already had the pleasure of listening to him. Just for those of you who weren't, a brief presentation of Professor Jason. So he teaches world history at Binghamton University, where he also coordinates the World Ecology Research Collective, and he is the well-known author of several books and a lot of essays and articles as well. Amongst those most well-known, we have, of course, Capitalism in the Web of Life, Ecology and Accumulation of Capital, published by Verso, or also in the role of editor, Anthropocene or Capitalocene, Nature, History and the Crisis of Capitalism. His several books and essays have been awarded several prizes, including the Alice Hamilton Prize in Environmental History, the Byers and Bernstein Prize in Agrarian Studies, or the Braverman in Labor Studies, and also the Manuel Wallerstein Award. His interviews, lectures and essays can all be found on Jason's personal website, which is a source that I frequently consult as well, and which is very nice as well that he makes the effort to make all of this available freely to those interested in reading his work. So today's lecture will be entitled Anthropocene, Capitalocene and Proletariocene, the climate class nexus from antiquity to historical capitalism. And so thank you very much, Jason, and please. Yeah.
Thank you so much. It is a treat to be here, and for those of you who were with us on Monday, welcome back, and we will try to walk through the world historical basis of those arguments we encountered on Monday about the crisis of cheap nature, the crisis of liberal democracy, and the crisis of accumulation. Well, as we know, we are exiting the Holocene, a 19th century concept, which, by the way, included everything that people now associate with the Anthropocene. Holocene was a concept that always took seriously anthropogenic action and the human transformation of the biosphere. But before we dig into the climate history, I want to make explicit some of the elements of my discovery of Marxism, and I mean that in a very specific way. So, unlike most Marxists, I didn't begin with Marx and then impose a certain model on history, but rather I was always captivated by world history. And Marx and Engels have a wonderful phrase in the German ideology that I only discovered, well, in my middle age, unfortunately, that the historical materialist always constantly remains on the real ground of history. And so this is a way of sharing with you that I discovered Marx through world history, and I discovered world history through Marx. The intention of historical materialism, of course, is to avoid both empiricism and theoreticism. I think that Marxism as a method, as a historical, as a geohistorical, that is an earth historical method, has been dramatically underappreciated. That in the German ideology, which is their foundational statement of historical materialism, written in Paris in 1845, they begin with this, that all historical writing sets out from the physical organization of living human individuals and their consequent relation to the rest of nature. This comprises the actual physical nature of man, as well as the natural conditions in which he finds himself, geological, orohydrographical, climatic, and so on. Yes, indeed, that is there from the beginning. And by the way, consequent here doesn't mean a linear movement. It means they are establishing the moments, the dialectical moments that form a rich totality of many determinations. to borrow Marx's phrase from the Grundrisse. And what does this mean if we take it seriously? It means that we take seriously the centrality of labor and production, which includes reproduction, by the way. And in the web of life, that labor relations, human relations form in and through their metabolism with the rest of life. This is a very transhistorical conception, and of course also fundamental to Marxism is the movement to successively more specific abstractions or determinations. So that, of course, Marx and Engels are not leaving it at this very high level of abstraction, but they are ready to move towards the determinations of, as Marx says later in Capital 3, the specific economic form, so on and so forth. Well, how do we take this seriously? Is this a class struggle method? Of course, as Engels clarifies in the manifesto, all written history says so. It's taught, this is about the history of class society. And fundamental to Marx's conception as he matures, there is, I should say, no epistemic or ontological or other break between the young and the old Marx, which we used to debate furiously. That man confronts the materials of nature as a force of nature, and then importantly, that in this process of mutual determination of human labor and the web of life, the labor process develops the potentialities slumbering within nature. This is very important. This is the principle of emergence, that the process of class struggle and social transformation leads to emergent phenomena. Finally, that capitalist production is, not only undermines the original sources of all wealth, in that famous passage from Capital, the soil and the worker. This passage is read almost always in exactly the wrong way. This is not the soil over here and the worker over here. It is the soil and the worker, that every proletarian is, if you will, a biotarian. And I promise that we're going to move on to the history in just a moment, but I want to tease these elements out because I think that historical materialism has been routinely butchered and been misunderstood for a long time. Not only does historical materialism insist that we resolve our theoretical, philosophical, conceptual differences on the real ground of history. That real ground of history does not begin with abstract man and abstract nature. This is often said, well, how can you say there's no such thing as anthropogenic climate change? Aren't capitalists humans? Well, from a Marxist standpoint, no. They are not humans. And indeed, the point of departure is not abstract man against abstract nature. This was absolutely central to Marx's critique of idealism, absolutely central to the formation of historical materialism. We all know that 11th thesis on Feuerbach, the philosophers have only interpreted the world. The point is to change it. But everyone forgets about the 6th thesis, which is arguably just as important, which is there is no abstract man. This is the defect of Feuerbach's thinking. There's only historical man in successive and variable historical ensembles, which are always with and within webs of life. And in this, historical man emerges through labor, not in a labor reductionism, as I'll point out, but as a labor ontology dialectically understood, that labor itself is a force of nature that is specifically endowed. It's not supernatural. He criticizes the German socialists famously in the Goethe program for giving supernatural powers to labor. That's what he's arguing against. And this is the basis for what I've called in the new introduction to capitalism in the web of life, a labor theory of life. And this means that we take seriously Engels' apt formulation of labor created man, of course not as a labor reductionism, but the labor process as the point of departure, the point of return for that rich totality of many determinations that weaves together, and this is the crucial moment of the argument here, dialectical antagonisms and non-dialectical antagonisms. And non-dialectical antagonisms include orbital variations, volcanic eruptions, solar cycles, asteroids and comets hitting the Earth. Until recently, earthquakes. Earthquakes are now affected by capitalist development, and so is the wobble of the Earth, by the way. So some non-dialectical antagonisms become, whether they're dialectical or not, we'll see, but they become progressively subject to capitalism's laws of motion. And so the implication here is that human metabolic relations are always labor relations with and within webs of life, joining the production and reproduction of real life, as Engels once wrote in a letter, an 1876 letter or something very close to that. And so when we are thinking environmental history, this standpoint allows us to understand that civilizations respond differently to the same non-dialectical antagonisms, that civilizations respond differently to the climate effects of volcanic eruptions, for instance. They respond differently in different parts of the world to distinctive non-dialectical antagonisms. These two moments have to be put together. For instance, soil exhaustion is not a dialectical antagonism. It's narrated in that way by eco-socialists, but it's not, and we don't need dialectics to understand that soil nutrients are exhausted by specific agronomic regimes, cotton versus wheat versus maize, so on and so forth. Well, this is very important for beginning to understand the history of climate and civilization. The key concept here is what they call climate class conjuncture. That yes, climate, for the most part, and there are some significant exceptions, but for the most part before the 17th century is non-anthropogenic, is natural forcing. And civilizations respond differentially to that, especially to the degree that they are stuck in the northern hemisphere and in the temperate zone and have no access to the tropics. This is a very, very crude and simplified version of why China is apparently more resilient over the ages, although we'll get into the effects on that as well. The takeaway here is that moments of climate, of unfavorable climate, which until the 21st century was by and large in the northern hemisphere too cold, although drought was a huge issue in the Levant, it was a huge issue in sub-Saharan Africa, especially significant with the rise of the slave trade, and cycles of drought and war and slaving were intimately connected with the intensification of extreme cold in the north, in the northern hemisphere, the North Atlantic. But this is an annotated version of two proxies that are somewhat out of date, but they still basically communicate the essence of the dynamic. On the top are solar cycles over the past 2,000 years. And on the bottom, sorry, it's cut off, and we'll come back to this again. On the bottom is a chart of volcanic activity. And to make a very, very long story very, very short, whenever the climate becomes more favorable in the global north, you have efflorescences, you have golden ages of civilization. And whenever it's bad or very bad, you have either developmental crises, so for instance, the Roman Empire in the famous 3rd century general crisis. That's at a moment of the fading of the Roman climate optimum. Yes, that's the name of that climate period. That basically coincides with the rise of the Roman Republic and an empire. And there are also epochal crises, the crisis of the Roman West in the Dark Ages cold period in the 5th century, starting in the 5th century, and the crisis of feudalism with the onset of the Little Ice Age. Well, this is important, and for all sorts of reasons, and generally the way that climate science history and climate historians try to deal with these questions is in a model of general interactivity. This is essentially a crude empiricist method that's inherited from Cold War causal pluralism. Just to be clear, causal pluralism doesn't mean that if you're a Marxist or a dialectical thinker, you deal with a multiplicity of factors as well. but you don't see the plural factors as independent. This is the debate with somebody like Adam Tooze today, who's a kind of left-wing, the extreme left-wing of the Financial Times and the World Economic Forum. Brilliant, but multiple factors that are somehow converging. No. To the extent that we can hold that, we can say that there are non-dialectical antagonisms in play. They always are, but certainly in the moment, the climate crisis is a dialectical antagonism. And the basic pattern that comes out when we look at don't worry, we're going to come back to this, but these moments of developmental and epochal crisis that are closely synced with climate downturns is that there is a class dynamic that is fundamentally shaped by climate changes. And as we know in the famous Marxist account in the manifesto, the development of capitalist infrastructure brings workers together, workers learn how to communicate and organize on a progressively larger scale. We all know this. This is an argument for the enhancement of potential or latent class capacities, to borrow from Joran Thurborn, the famous sociologist. However, what's generally, almost universally ignored to my knowledge is the notion that what favorable climate and unfavorable climate do for class capacities, the class capacities of the rulers and those of the direct producers. And here's basically what happens, that bad climate dramatically undermines the class power of ruling classes and dramatically enhances the class power of the direct producers. This seems to hold across class societies. And the lack of recognition of this dynamic, what they call a series of climate class conjunctures, means that we don't have in our scholarly sensibility a basic pattern that holds certainly across the past 2,000 years, which is that moments of dramatically unfavorable climate lead to eras of political crisis, not just popular revolt, that's a big part of it, but also internecine warfare amongst ruling classes. This was obviously the case in the last centuries of Roman rule, and dramatically the case in the crisis of feudalism, when the seigneurs were defeated in the class struggle in the countryside, and the cities were in revolt as well. And what they did was then go to war with each other. This was the lovely history of the late 14th and early 15th century, when everybody was trying to conquer everyone else. Well, this is don't worry, we're going to come back to this again and again throughout this talk, but this is a mapping of successive climate class conjunctures. Don't worry, I'm going to gesture towards East Asia, but I can't do this whole survey knowledgeably enough to weave in the history of China, which is very interesting. So these are elements drawn from the crisis, the successive crises of the Roman West in the 5th century, the feudal Europe in the 14th century, and then these two major climate-related upheavals and eras of crisis. The long 17th century, for decades recognized as a period of profound tumult and crisis and transition. And the long 19th century, which is generally not connected to climate, but is the moment of the Dalton minimum, that is the solar downturn in solar energy reaching the Earth, and then also the volcanic activity of Iceland's Loki Fissure. This was, as we know, an era of the most profound, to that point, the most profound, the most serious challenge to capitalist rule that the system had yet seen. And yet, what we get in the dominant media, ideological, and academic world is man versus nature. So this is the standpoint of the bourgeoisie. There is no way to have a man-nature framework where man and nature come first, or humanity and nature, or whatever the contemporary frame is, that is not the standpoint of the bourgeoisie. This is abstract man and abstract nature. Is it useful? Yes. But is it ideological, and is it dangerous? Yes to that. as well. And so this is the argument for the Anthropocene. And I won't go into this, we are very familiar with this, but the immediate popularization of the Anthropocene, which was initially formulated as Anthropozoic in the 1920s and came out of the Holocene. The Anthropocene is completely unoriginal, and it basically retooled two earlier moments, the moment of Spaceship Earth environmentalism, and indeed took on board Spaceship Earth's vocabulary and rhetoric. The human enterprise comes from Paul Ehrlich. Life support systems comes from ecological economists, and then of course the notion of the human role in the biosphere, which had long been recognized, comes out of the Holocene in the 19th century. And the counterpoint to this was the Capitalocene, and the Capitalocene argument was really two things. It was one, a questioning of the very essence, ideological essence of man versus nature as the first order problematique, that problem of the eternal culture as I talked about on Monday. And then it was also a sustained argument about the origins of capitalism's environmental crisis. And to understand the origins of planetary crisis today, we needed to understand the origins of capitalism. To understand what was happening in the terminal crisis of capitalism that is now unfolding, we had to understand the conditions of its birth and its patterns of development over the long run. I think we are generally familiar with this dynamic, and yet it cannot be said often enough that the defining feature of environmentalism, of Spaceship Earth, of the Anthropocene advocates was to avoid naming the system. We know that the evidence here is overwhelming. This is the carbon majors focuses on corporate power. Of course, capitalism is more than corporate power. And it is possible, indeed, many people do emphasize corporate power, but within the standpoint of the bourgeoisie, that this is an interactive model. And one of the through lines of this talk is that all of these ideas are, as Marx would point out, social relations, they are historical relations, and the model of Earth system science, while extraordinarily complex, ultimately goes back to the collisionism, the green arithmetic model of society plus nature that emerged in earnest during the scientific revolution and the Cartesian revolution, which goes even beyond the realm of science. This is, for all their incorporation of nonlinearity, this is ultimately a collisionist model. That's, in fact, one of their favorite words to use. A collision, interaction, this is all billiard balls crashing into each other. It is in some mechanical causation rather than dialectical causation. And what that does is it begins to occlude and blind us to this history of popular revolts and political crises in successive moments of unfavorable climate change. And unfavorable largely means, of course, that it's good in the European and Chinese context, the temperate context is too cold. But it also, because Western Asia and Eastern Asia are linked by the Great Eurasian Steppe, it also means that drought on the Eurasian Steppe, which was a massive problem in the 4th century, could send steppe peoples moving into the heartlands of civilization, and that was a recurrent dynamic of world history on both sides of Eurasia. And here I'm just sharing a few more insights here from Marx and Engels. This is Marx and Engels at the beginning of historical materialism, reminding us that the production of life is about daily production and intergenerational production. It's also about cooperation as a productive force. They are quite explicit about this. And we've walked through these elements here, but the implication is again, I mean, extraordinary here. Everybody talks about interdisciplinarity and all the rest. From the very beginning of historical materialism, they were insisting that we understand the natural sciences and the social sciences, the division of intellectual labor, the means of mental production, their words, and from the standpoint of the proletariat, from the standpoint of historical materialism, the drive was to create a single science, dare I say, a proletarian science. And while that term has a certain baggage, I think it's fully consistent with the overall emphasis and priority of a dialectical approach to knowledge, history, and the understanding of the human condition through labor. So this labor theory of life, this reading of Marx is very important to helping us really keep an analytical and political focus on climate change as a climate-class conjuncture. Of course, class is expressed through manifold mediations, you know, the state, culture, social movements, etc., etc. And these are not, these movements of labor, land, and life, power, profit, and planetary life, they're not separate categories, but interpenetrating moments of capitalism's epochal crisis. I think this is politically relevant. This might sound very abstract. I hope it doesn't. But it is fundamental to opposing the neo-Malthusian politics and imaginaries that were set in motion about in a mature way, about 50 years ago. This is our friend Garrett Hardin, the famous eugenicist, author of Tragedy of the Commons, and his lifeboat ethics, which, by the way, were also supported fully and enthusiastically by eco-fascists like Lovelock, famous for his Gaia hypothesis, later adopted by Latour, which was unfortunate but understandable for Latour, who ended his life calling for a defense of the European homeland. So the counterpoint to this, and the counterpoint to the Malthusian imaginary, is a labor theory of life, an emphasis on climate class conjunctures. When somebody like Matt Huber says climate change is class war, he's about half the way there. But he has a very narrow conception of class, an economic reductionist conception of class, one that has led the socialist forces into supporting wars all the way from Kautsky to Bernie Sanders. And so the important thing to understand about the Malthusian imaginary is that it is about natural law. It is an ideological argument that insists the laws of nature explain inequality. This is an excerpt from the second essay published in 1803, where he says, look, you know, there's enough for all the people at the table, but everyone else, they're just going to have to, you know, be left to fend for themselves. So what Malthus was doing was writing in a period of climate change and a period of popular revolt, and giving a formal theory of natural law and of the necessity of the natural order. There is no alternative, long before Maggie Thatcher. So Malthus is himself a little Ice Age ruling class figure, centrally caught up with the dynamics of imperialism. He was the world's first professional economist. He occupied the chair in political economy at the East India Company's College. And his ideas shaped the brutal and bloody and ultimately quite genocidal attitudes of the British Empire in imperial officials in East India and the East India Company for a very long period of time. So this was a moment of profound popular revolt, again, a climate class conjuncture. And one of the crucial cycles for making sense of capitalist politics around climate, around environmental questions, is, as geographers and anthropologists have insisted for a half century, is making sense of Malthus. But in fact, Malthus was not just Malthus. There was a long Malthusian cycle, indeed one that predated Malthus. It goes back to the era of Descartes and John Locke, of course insisting in Locke's case that indigenous peoples lived in a state of nature. They were unable to improve the land. This was directly in response to the crises of the long, cold 17th century, a climate crisis, the coldest period over the past 8,000 years. And in this era of Locke and Descartes, this Cartesian revolution, which was central to the civilizing projects of the era, it was the invention of man and nature. Sylvia Wynter once called this, the invention of man, the over-representation of the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie is so arrogant it imagines itself as the best of humankind, and everybody else is a savage. Of course, indigenous peoples, Africans, but also Celts, Slavs, women, basically everyone, you know, the bottom, I don't know, 95% of the population. And this is reinvented across civilizing projects from the 16th century onward. Christianizing projects, civilizing projects, to development. Coined, that term comes into the ruling class vernacular with President Truman's Point 4 inaugural address in his famous Point 4 speech in 1949, where he declares 80% of the planet undeveloped and, you know, too stupid, too lazy to actually do anything for themselves. Well, this long Malthusian cycle is a kind of ideological, cultural, political cycle that is intimately connected to capitalism as a world ecology, intimately connected to the imperial drive to appropriate at very low cost the free or cheap labor, food, energy, and raw materials available on the frontier zones that are being colonized, are being subordinated by empire in every successive era. So we can't just be economic determinists, we can't just be cultural reductionists, we can't just be environmental scholars looking at climate separated from capitalism, which is what virtually all climate historians do. We have to begin to put these moments together, culture and political economy and class in the web of life. So this long Malthusian cycle is very, very significant to our times to begin to understand why these ideologies of man and nature, and as I was saying on Monday, whenever the ruling classes are threatened in the modern world, they always, always, always return to nature and natural law in various forms. Now, here's the thing, that doesn't mean that everything that, say, Paul Ehrlich said was false. It doesn't mean that everything Malthus said, most of what Malthus said was false, actually. He's a very, very ill-informed thinker, totally chaotic. I mean, Ricardo was much better, Adam Smith was much better. Marx was really on solid ground when he was always ridiculing Malthus. But it doesn't mean that, for instance, today, Johann Rockström and Planetary Boundaries doesn't give us useful information. But we have to understand that planetary boundaries as an ideological and cultural phenomena is very, very real. So every year he travels to the World Economic Forum and he hangs out with his super rich, super powerful friends. He gives interviews to The Guardian saying, you know, tree huggers and environmental activists, they're fine, but really what we need to do is get serious and work with, quote, the bankers and the CEOs. That's from the Guardian interview in 2021. And so this long Malthusian cycle is very, very important, even when it's not about population. And indeed, that's the shift from 1968 to 2025. That today, the Malthusian cycle works, the nature in question, the natural law in question works very differently. But it moved the Malthusian argument about consumption, about population growth into consumption. That everything became overconsumption. And that's a classic Malthusian move because it doesn't deal with the social relations of power, profit, and life. It reduces everything to the individual and a kind of linear causation through which individual actions linearly affect climate change, which is absolutely false and indeed is politically disabling and has been politically disabling for left environmentalism for a long time. So and eugenics in the late 19th century, this was another moment. You can see this is a very crude indicator, but whenever cross-border migration spikes, then you begin to have a natural law response. One of them in the late 19th century, following the late 19th century, was the rise of blood and soil nationalism. There's a recurrence of that in interesting ways today. And so what we need to do if we want to begin to make sense of climate is we have to begin to make sense of how human labor is organized and put those two moments together. And strikingly, it's this nexus of labor and climate that is really rarely discussed in a systematic way. This is this is from Richard Freeman's famous article in The Great Dublin, where he talked about the massive expansion of the Reserve Army of Labor following the liberalization of India, the overthrow of the Soviet Union, China's sort of capitalist road turn after 1979, and all of this. So this is crucial to making sense of the climate crisis, and yet we rarely think in these terms. So part of my argument is that we need to put these two moments together in a much more systematic way than we have before. Here's our friend Johan Rockström and his planetary boundaries. This is presented as de facto the scientific argument behind a so-called climate emergency, which is fraught with all sorts of political and policy implications. And it refuses to look at the fundamentally modern creation of a modern working class, which is at once proletariat, femitariat, and biotariat. That is, that for every quantum of paid work, there must be a disproportionately larger share of unpaid work provided by women, nature, and colonies, to give a stylized expression from the great Maria Mies, the German Marxist feminist. And I think all of these begin to open up questions that are fundamental to our analytics, to the kind of research we do, to the kinds of politics and political questions that we pose. Is this crisis anthropogenic or capitalogenic? That's like, it's interesting what the anthropogenic people say is, well, capitalogenic, that's like political. Well, it's more truthful. And anthropogenic is itself, in its denial of politics, a classic instance of what Jim Ferguson once called anti-politics. That is the advancing of elite technocratic rule, anti-democratic rule, through innocent-sounding phrases that are, and ideological premises that are, in fact, deeply, deeply political. And only when we begin to ask questions about capitalogenic climate change can we begin to answer questions about the kind of crisis this is today. Now, there are many eco-socialists who absolutely disagree with me. They say that the climate crisis is going to extinguish human life, but not extinguish capitalism. And this is a crazy argument to me. It doesn't make sense. It's palpably absurd. Once you look at it, capitalism is not going to continue until the last tree is cut, because the more trees that are cut down and the fewer trees that are available, metaphorically speaking, the harder it is to reproduce capital in an expanded way. Capitalism is not a steady state system. So we have to begin to ask questions about what kind of crisis this really is. Is it a developmental crisis, one that can be resolved through new rounds of restructuring, primitive accumulation, new imperialism, and all of that, or is it an epochal crisis? So as scholars, in order to develop a reasonable response, I said the eco-socialist version of saying, well, it's not an epochal crisis. I said that's absurd, but there could well be a serious justification for saying that there is a developmental crisis. However, we have to actually look at the overaccumulation of capital, which none of those people want to do. the volume of overaccumulated capital in the world is extraordinary. You have, according to Bloomberg, $19 trillion of capital parked in zero or negative rate of return government securities around the world. And it's related to other pathological symptoms like shadow banking, etc. Which is increasingly, we learned this from the Panama Papers, that the billionaire class is simply hoarding more and more and more wealth and producing and not investing in it. That there's been a crisis in investment across the OECD zone for the past 20 to 25 years. Somebody like Michael Roberts is very good on this, but also Brent Christopher is writing about rentier capitalism and many others. So what we need to do if our project is dialectical and synthetic, in the best sense of that term, is to put together these very familiar representations of geological, geophysical inflection points. This is all very familiar with geohistorical representations of other inflection points. So whether we agree with the falling rate of profit theory or not doesn't matter. Clearly, there is an overaccumulation of capital. Capital is deeply crisis prone, and capital globally has only been stabilized since the Great Recession through two key developments. One is China built its way and the world's way out of the recession, and then through infrastructure projects. And then the other has been the massive centralization of capital, especially in the form of so-called passive index firms like State Street, BlackRock, and Vanguard, which are, by the way, the largest shareholders in the top 500 corporations of the world, outside of China, the largest 500 corporations, and they are the largest shareholders in each other. This is something that is orders of magnitude beyond anything that Lenin and Luxembourg and Hilferding were seeing before World War I. And we have to be able to put these two moments, the physical and the political economic, therefore class, capital, political power with webs of life, all together to make sense of, for instance, the fundamental socio-ecological limit of capital, which rests in the crisis of the agricultural revolution model. Climate change is so deeply suppressing productivity that another revolution will not occur. Another mode of production might have a different way of organizing an agricultural revolution. That's a different question. But capital's agricultural revolution model, as we all learned from capital, and can follow that all the way from the English and the Dutch to the Americans and beyond in the 20th century, that model is cooked. It's done. Put a fork in it. And that means that, that the civilization has to deal with something that resembles a steady state mode of production. That is not literally zero rate of growth, but something very, very close to it. And all of this that I'm sharing with you, I think, involves an intellectual journey that is much more uncomfortable than we usually suppose. But I think that the questions of synthesis can be fruitfully brought together. At a minimum, we have to be able to put together the crisis of life-making and the crisis of profit-making. That's related to all sorts of political and social struggles, geopolitical conflicts, many, many other dynamics, cultural dynamics, as I was speaking about on Monday, the culture of fear, the exhaustion of capitalist myth-making around progress. But these two moments have to be brought together if we want to begin to offer compelling accounts of the present conjuncture. And this is only through this kind of synthesis can we begin to answer that question of what kind of crisis is it? Is it developmental? Is it ethical? So on and so forth. So what do we do? Well, of course, this is not the answer. This is one, I think, necessary contribution, maybe a pillar of an answer, but not, of course, the whole answer. That we have to look at actually existing world history, which the academic left has largely run away from over the past 40 years, since more or less the early 1980s. it's hard to imagine now, but the leading public intellectuals on the left in Europe and the United States were historical intellectuals in the 70s and 80s, and now not so much. Those debates rarely occur. Indeed, the eco-socialists who have disagreed with me have, to a person, refused to engage the historical question. But these historical questions are absolutely fundamental. Paul Sweezy, Rosa Luxemburg, George Georg Lukács, many others talked about the present as a historical, indeed as a world historical moment. So what's one of the big takeaways that we need to engage? Well, one of them is that unfavorable climate change is bad for ruling classes. Doesn't mean that the producers always win, but often dark ages for the ruling classes are golden ages for the producing classes. So here we're back here. So after the climate class conjuncture of the 4th and 5th centuries in the Roman West, peasants across Western and Central Europe reestablished a kind of peasant communism. They lived healthier because class structures were completely destroyed. Women and men lived much more equally. They regulated their fertility. We used to think there was a huge population collapse. There wasn't. It was a long, slow population decline. It was indeed a golden age for peasants across Western and Central Europe for a while. In the history of capitalism, we should recognize that the history of climate crisis does not begin with the machinery of the Industrial Revolution. It begins with, the history of climate crisis begins with the imperialist expansion of the 16th and 17th century. Fundamentally coordinated out of Portugal, amongst other places, but essentially Portugal was, and the empire was central to the rise of capitalism and to the development of new models of power, profit, and life. The plantation revolutions of Madeira, São Tomé, northeastern Brazil are just the most instructive moments. I mean, that revolution is as important to the 17th century as Henry Ford and the auto-making assembly line revolution was to the 20th century. And somehow we just pretend that was not a moment of capitalogenic climate crisis, as the search for cheap labor in the Americas, the principle of just war, and the entradas in Brazil, for instance, and then the Jesuit missions. It's from the Jesuits in Brazil that we get the modern word pacification, and also the first forms of what was called in the Vietnam War strategic hamlets, concentrate the indigenous populations so they could be converted, but also, of course, so they could work for free for the rulers. And that was behind the destruction of American indigenous populations. The microbes were responsible directly, maybe for 30%. That would have been horrific, but we're talking 95%. Soils were then left undisturbed, forests grew back, and CO2 concentrations fell. That was a contributing factor to this worst or most cold climate of the past 8,000 years in the long, cold 17th century. And as a result of that, there was a dramatic drive within Europe, as we know from the work of Silvia Federici, this gendered primitive accumulation to create a modern femitariat and reservoirs of unpaid work under the sign of nature transmuted into modern gender categories that were fundamental to the rapid proletarianization of Western Europe, taking Western Europe's population, proletarian share of the population from more or less 25% in the 1550s to more or less 50% by the 1750s. This was extraordinary, not just in the English process, but it was also the moment of the transatlantic slave trade. The indigenous peoples were killed off, so cheap labor had to be found. And gradually, and in fits and starts, you have the emergence of modern race relations, again constructed, just like gender, wholly out of the categories of bourgeois naturalism, and codified into law very tentatively in Brazil in the early 17th century, but then much more almost everywhere in Brazil, the Caribbean, the Carolinas by the end of the 17th century, by the end of this first great era of capitalist or capitalogenic climate crisis. And this also reveals that this was in no way a story, a Malthusian story of population, of overpopulation, anything like that. Indeed, it is a story of population, but of Marx's general law of capitalist accumulation, that long chapter right before primitive accumulation in Capital, which is great to read, and it is a long story about how proletarianization, political power, labor markets are formed through the dynamics of capital accumulation and the political entities that can never just be patient. This was also central to Luxembourg. Nobody ever talks about it because they don't want to look at how labor is organized and how proletarianization occurs. And for some reason, the story of proletarianization, which is absolutely at the center of environmental history, not just climate history, but environmental history in the modern world, has been totally, totally ignored. All right, so I want to spend maybe 10, 15 minutes doing a whirlwind tour, like it hasn't been whirlwind already, I know, but doing a whirlwind tour through these climate class conjunctures, just to give you a sense, to whet your appetite, if you will, for the pattern. I think patterns are very, very important. Patterns do not mean everything is identical, but it means that there's something instructive. This is drawing on the work of Kanuski and his colleagues about the Bronze Age, so-called collapse. I hate the word collapse. I think it's a neo-Malthusian concept, as I've argued. But certainly, if collapse was ever justified, it was in looking at the collapse of the Bronze Age states. Pretty much only Egypt survives in more or less its intact form. The other major states, the Mycenaeans, the Hittites, the Assyrians sort of survive and have to reinvent themselves. But there's this massive, not just a massive movement of peoples, the so-called sea peoples, who are still the subject of some mystery, but also popular revolts across the Bronze Age crisis. In this case, we're looking at drought, and of course this is a recurrent feature of Levantine history and Middle Eastern history, long cycles of drought that are related in interesting ways to shifts in the North Atlantic Oscillation, the Gulf Stream, and so on and so forth. But we see here dramatic, unfavorable climate change and popular revolt, civilizational crisis. So again, this is the same image we keep coming back to, that we have these major moments of unfavorable climate change, agricultural crisis, political crisis, popular revolt. Political crisis means, of course, civil wars amongst the elites. This is a very, very common, or in the history of 17th and 19th century capitalism, of world war. It's crucial to keep this in mind. Now, as I was saying, I can't do the whole story. I can't do it justice to what was happening in the East, but the work of Zhang and Li and their team is working out of Hong Kong. I forget which university, but Zhang and Li are they're environmental determinists, okay, and they're neo-Malthusians, but they're really, really interesting. And they are establishing these rough and ready correlations. I'm not always in agreement with their argument, but it's important. This is Fang and Su from last year. Peasant revolts, frequency of peasant uprisings, and climatic shifts across the longue durée. This is still provisional, but even though they're neo-Malthusians, they're bringing to the center, in this case of Fang and Su, something that Marxists have largely not touched, which is the class struggle is always a class struggle in the web of life, and the story of peasant rebellions is always a story of, in which climate and other environmental factors are implicated. Now again, this is not determinism, but it is determination. That these biological, biophysical, geophysical moments are precisely that. They are crucial moments without which we cannot adequately make sense of the longue durée of class struggle and the patterns of class struggle and, as I've been insisting with proletarianization, of class formation. This is very, very important. That's why Marx ends Capital. He ends Capital with a story of class formation and links it to questions of empire and questions of the web of life as well in very interesting ways. This is simply to give you a geographical picture of the Roman climatic optimum, that Rome flourishes in great measure because it has the climatic wind at its back. The climate kind of blows these sails of civilization, or can just inflict these storms, these terrible storms, metaphorically speaking, on civilizational structures. This is RWP and MWP signal the Roman warm period, which is another name for the Roman climate optimum. Medieval warm period is also called the medieval climate anomaly because it wasn't warm everywhere, but in Europe it was. Roman warm period, medieval warm period, and then I guess they call that the capitalist warm period at the very end. That Roman medieval warm period are moments of dramatic ruling class formation and the formation of the structures of those modes of production. So for the Romans, latifundia and Roman slavery. One reason I was always in favor of the barbarian migrations is they destroyed the world's greatest slaveholding society at that point. That was a net positive. The barbarian invasions, good. But Roman warm period, medieval warm period, you have the formation of those distinctive class structures associated with Western Rome's mode of production and the so-called feudal revolution right around the year 1000 in medieval Europe. That's the era where we get the knights in shining armor and the cathedrals and the Castilian landscape and all of that. These are climate class conjunctures. So climate class conjuncture is not only on the downswing, but also on the upswing. And that's crucial to keep in mind. This is just a simple visualization that draws on Ulf Bunken's team's work. That you can see that as the Roman warm period gives way to the Dark Ages cold period, or what's called the late antique Little Ice Age. That's a mouthful. And that when it's very, very cold, you see the crisis of the existing class structure, and then there is another turning point, in this case, what's called the Merovingian, after the French, the Merovingian agrarian watershed, and then followed up by the Carolingian Renaissance, which is essentially the initial phase, the primitive accumulation phase of feudalism, where that class structure and its characteristic mode of organization take shape. So these are fundamental dynamics to understanding the history of class society. Here again, you can see the pulsation of cold warming and cooling, the kind of centralization and boom of feudal civilization. But then, Charlemagne's empire falls apart during the cooling and severe winters and cattle plagues and everything else of the 9th and 10th century. Then it gets warmer, and you have the prototypical medieval agricultural revolution, the introduction of new rotations, of three-field systems, of the diffusion of the heavy moldboard plow, and all of that. So climate largely has these impacts that I'm talking about through agriculture and the agroecology nexus. A warmer climate, a longer growing season means, all things being equal, more productivity, more land is open to cultivation. Cooling means the opposite. And since agriculture in any class society is really the socio-physical basis of surplus labor, you can see why it might be central to understanding the class struggle. So I'm going through this maybe too pedantically, but I think also that pedantry maybe is useful because we are so taught that these are Malthusian crises. So the crisis of feudal Europe is ultimately Malthusian, that in the dominant view, peasants did better because so many people died. So just the labor markets adjusted and peasants did better. Well, no. Yeah, I mean, that was part of it, but that was itself a part of the class struggle story. And what we saw across Western Europe in this period was a historic defeat of Europe's ruling classes. All the way from Iberia to Estonia to France and England. And these were only the metaphorical tips of the icebergs. This was not the whole story. And what it meant was that the feudal ruling classes could not reimpose feudalism. They had to be content with a smaller share of the social surplus. It was that pressure that led in different ways kings and queens, seigneurs, merchants, and yes, even the church, which was, as we know, also in crisis, to sort of clumsily find a way to into the Atlantic. This was enabled by all sorts of technical developments, the transition from portolan to modern cartography, the invention of the caravel, but also forms of financial organization pioneered by the Genoese, who were encamped in Lisbon and Sevilla and all over, a story that Raj Patel and I narrate in 7 Cheap Things. So the rise of capitalism was itself an unintentional outcome of the Little Ice Age crisis, the climate class conjuncture, and geographical accident. I mean, simply, if you were in Iberia and you could figure out the ocean currents, you could go to Brazil and you could come back. But if you were in Angola or the Congo, you could not. You could go to Brazil, but you couldn't come back, not very easily. And so geographical position matters. Again, like I was saying on Monday, environmental determinism, climate determinism, geographical determinism, not good. Those are not good ways, but those are all determinations, and we can't leave those out of the story. What I want to do is I want to make sure that we have time for the last little part of this talk, but I simply want to drive this point home. We have been taught for years after reading Alfred Crosby and the Columbian Exchange and biological imperialism, which didn't say anything about imperialism, but that's another story. They also, well, it was the microbes that killed all the indigenous peoples, and I highlighted this earlier, but I want to emphasize it. No, it was not. I include this map of the hot zones of the highest death rates, the highest mortality rates in Latin America. You can see there in that orange tan color. This is from Koch and Maslin and Lewis. Maslin and Lewis famously of this, the Orbis spike. I'll talk more about this in just a moment. But what they identify is that the centers of the highest mortality in the Americas were the centers of colonial expansion and the expansion of the commodity frontiers, stock raising, manufacturing, but above all, sugar planting in northeastern Brazil and Bahia, especially in colonial Peru, around Potosi. These were truly audacious capitalist enterprises that drove down the indigenous populations on a massive scale. This led directly to the Orbis spike, down the reduction in CO2 concentrations by modest numbers by today's figures, but by about 7 to 8 parts per million. That was significant enough to reinforce volcanic activity and other elements of natural forcing to produce this great crisis, the great crisis of the long, cold 17th century. Winter severity was extreme, not just in Europe, as this chart indicates, but also in North America. In Spain and Portugal in the 1550s and 1560s, even before this, the Orbis spike really could kick in a major way. The effects were widely observed and commented upon. That this was these were years of very bad harvests, and also, as we know, years of imperial crisis. Philip II becomes King of Portugal for a short time. For a short time in a long perspective, and he's trying to fight multiple wars at the same time. He's trying to reorganize colonial Peru, and meanwhile, everywhere, not just in Europe, but everywhere across Eurasia and the capitalist world, you have a massive popular revolts, almost everywhere. This is right in the heart of the long, cold 17th century. Again, a climate class dynamic. And here's basically what I always tell my students. Virtually everything important about capitalism forms in the 17th century, forms by the 17th century. There's very, very, very little that was truly epical afterwards, that up to and including so-called cognitive capitalism and all the rest. It formed in this era of climate crisis, and that's not incidental. So the intellectual, technological, political, and class formations of capitalism that become characteristic really mature over the course of this long, cold 17th century. And in this era of climate crisis, of course, a very specific kind of climate crisis, but we need to keep this in mind, that the thinking and the relations that formed during an earlier era of climate crisis are not going to help us now. But an important question persists. It is, if feudalism was undone and by the climate class conjuncture of the 14th century, why wasn't capitalism undone by conditions very, very similar in the 17th century? And the short version is the imperial drive towards cheap nature frontiers of labor, food, energy, and raw materials. You can see the massive growth of the slave trade relative to economic output. This draws on Angus Madison, who's not always the best, but is really the best that we have for economic growth figures. This is the drive to Africa, and the ramping up of the slave trade in earnest after 1600, a trickle in the 1570s, 80s, 90s, almost all to the sugar-producing zones of Brazil, but of course later to the Caribbean and what became the southern United States. And this was what I call a moment of climate forcing, that the birth of modern imperialism, the maturing of the overseas or the seaborne empires, as Charles Boxer likes to call them, was a climate class conjuncture. It was a climate phenomenon. So there was, in other words, a move towards the tropics that was absolutely central to the formation of the empires and to the survival of capitalism in this period. Essentially, capitalism could survive in the 17th century because it could knit together an empire stretching from Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean to Brazil, to the Newfoundland cod banks, to the Baltic, and knitted these together, this vast division of sort of biophysical zones and climate zones in a way that allowed the endless accumulation to continue. We know that this was, meanwhile, a period of just terrible wars, the 30 Years' War, but many others within Europe as well. And so, again, we want to keep this long Malthusian cycle in mind and this long climate cycle. They're not exactly the same, and that's important to keep in mind, but also that this was the way that capitalism learned to weather the storms of climate crises was by moving to the frontiers. What did the frontiers do? Well, yes, it made some capitalists very rich, but in a more technical and I think precise analytical way, it allowed for the expanded accumulation of capital to occur. And that's precisely what's not happening in the 21st century. The frontiers are too small. You can go to Sumatra, you can go to Amazonia, you can go to some pockets, maybe in Africa, but these are very, very small. They are not going to deliver the massive flows of cheap labor, food, energy, and raw materials sufficient to restart capital accumulation. That's absolutely not happening. There's no evidence to do this, and the result is a quantity-quality shift in the relations of political power to economic accumulation, where economic accumulation is essentially now protected by state power. Everything has become too big to fail, which is also positive because it makes the struggles more transparently political. All right, so we'll sort of wrap this up here by looking at and just reminding you of the basic model here, that capitalism booms and survives through these frontiers of appropriation. This is, of course, politically enabled, but the underlying dynamic is that of the circuit of capital, which you get here at the bottom of the slide. There is a long cycle that has much to do with climate and eventually ends up producing today's climate crisis, the rise and fall of these four chiefs through new civilizing projects, new scientific revolutions, the trinity of capital, science, and empire. And while Eco-socialist theory largely regards the commodification of everything as capitalism's success. This is wrong. The more that capital has to reproduce social life and planetary life, bear those costs, the more that the overaccumulation crisis deepens. And the responses, remember I said, well, proletarianization is absolutely central. Well, moments of climate crisis, these climate class conjunctures that we've looked at have all been moments of mass migration, which means necessarily they are moments of mass proletarianization. What we are seeing today is very much in line with the transition towards multiple, at least two post-capitalist visions of political accumulation, is the unprecedented militarization of borders. This is, of course, is directly in response to the climate crisis and to efforts to control labor. So remember, labor is no longer cheap. The era of cheap labor is essentially done on a scale sufficient to, again, relaunch capital accumulation. So when cheap labor in the old ways cannot be secured, it has to be produced in a new way through force. There are fewer carrots to distribute and more sticks become necessary. So you can see, and these are from 2018. You can only imagine how this spending, this is from the Transnational Institute, by the way, and their great report on the global climate wall. It's absolutely interesting, and these figures are out of date, and you can see the emergence of this, the border industrial complex in the United States. It's intimately tied to the biosecurity, biomedical regime, and the deep state as well, and handing over more and more de facto political authority to Silicon Valley, more aptly called Surveillance Valley, as Yasha Levine calls it. And this is part of the dynamic of the brave new world for the few in 1984 for the many that I identified on Monday. Here you can just look at what's happening with military spending. Again, surely this is much bigger. Russia's figure is certainly underestimated. China's is off the charts in terms of percentage increase, and quite reasonably so. These are all responses to, of course, what Lenin called over a century ago the wars of redivision. But today, the wars of redivision look fundamentally different at the end of capitalism than in the moment of the early 20th century, which was when it became apparent for the first time that the frontiers of capitalism were going to be over very, very soon. And all of the thinkers of that era, from the bourgeois thinkers like Hobson to Luxemburg and Lenin, all recognize this. But this is clearly a drive spearheaded in absolute terms by the United States towards world war. We'll see if Trump succeeds in managing American imperial decline more reasonably than Biden. So where are we at the end? Well, we have a long history of these climate changes and their climate class conjunctures. This basic idea gives us a way to thread the needle between climate determinism and social reductionism. This, of course, is the fundamental intellectual, theoretical, and I would say also political problem of environmental thought, and something that any approach that takes seriously questions of social power, whether you're Marxist or not, I don't know, but if you take social power and political power seriously, you have to understand that social power and political power are fundamentally shaped by climatic conditions. So I like to say climate's not everything, but you can't explain anything without climate, because climate is a kind of strand of DNA of the human social experience. Well, does this mean that we're headed towards the proletariat? Well, potentially yes. And I think it's easy to dismiss the left and the possibility of a socialist transition today, because, let's face it, the world's working classes and the left have been getting their asses kicked for 50 years. And yes, it is very serious. We were having a friendly conversation earlier. We're screwed. We may not be dead, but we're screwed. Well, I wouldn't be so sure. I think that one of the insights from this longer view of climate class conjunctures is that really ruling classes, just like generals are always prepared to fight the last war, ruling classes are always prepared to fight the last great challenge. They are hardwired to fight the socialist and communist national liberation struggles of the 20th century. But what we saw after the pandemic, or rather after the great financial crisis, and it was short-circuited by the declarations of pandemic lockdowns, was, according to Andrei Korotoyev and his colleagues, they're not leftists, they said, look, they constructed a global index of popular unrest. It was a very motley index, and it included everything from terrorism to the occupation of political squares. Public squares, a political occupation of public squares. And what he said was that this was the greatest explosion of popular unrest in the history of capitalism. I think that's an important data point. We can nitpick it at his global index, we should, but I think he was basically correct that there was this extraordinary but very politically chaotic moment of massive, widespread, and intense popular revolt across the planet in the decade after the great financial crisis, of course kicked off by the Arab Spring, and that was itself complicated by all sorts of factors, not least the CIA and soft power institutions like the National Endowment for Democracy and USAID and all the rest of it. But nevertheless, it is clear that there was a moment of politically chaotic, left, right, center, everywhere in between, politically chaotic yet very, very serious popular unrest, resistance, as we've learned to say, not revolution so much, but a moment of spectacular and profound upheaval. And the underlying conditions have not gone away. The pandemic declarations seem to kind of stop that in its tracks for a moment, but as we've been seeing, it's been coming back over the past few years. So I think to begin to make sense of climate politics, climate movements, and the possibility of climate transition, we need to start just really digging deeply into this history of climate class conjunctures. I think that's where we can find a reasonable hope and a reasonable political strategy and the clarity of vision necessary to carry it out. Thank you very much.
We don't have a lot of time for questions, but just maybe a couple. I would just thank you that you get up so that you can be it can be recorded wisely and that you present yourself before asking the question. Sorry.
According to our director. Questions?
So I have a question. You have to stand up. You didn't have time to elaborate on your incredibly optimistic claim about the proletariat, and I would like to hear.
Well, there's a question mark there.
Yeah. But what are the signs for that? Because it seems to me that the history of transitions that we talked about, in particular the long 17th century. I would say that most people reading you and listening to you would come out with a very pessimistic, actually, conclusion. I mean, the climate crisis is good for ruling classes, right? I mean, that's
no, but climate crisis
it's good. It's good for shifts. It enables certain shifts and it creates new ruling classes, right? So the question is, what new ruling classes are emerging today?
Well, I think first of all we have to understand that the way that capitalism deals with its crises is by going to frontiers. So if there are no frontiers, it cannot fix its own crises, which is what's happening today. The fix to the proposed climate crisis is a form of planetary management and political rule that subordinates economic competition. But economic competition has essentially been terminated under capitalism. The degree of hyper-centralization is unprecedented. In the 17th century, there was plenty of economic competition, plenty of political competition, and plenty of frontiers to move to find the cheap labor, energy, raw materials, land to produce food, and all of that. So today, clearly you have massive industrial working classes, not least in China, that are truly significant. Now, they're not revolutionary at this moment in consciousness and politics, but the tensions are there. And of course, leave it to the CCP to find a very wise and sophisticated strategy forward. They did what everybody, all of my colleagues in North America who studied China's political economy said, no, China won't be able to build its own home market and produce, it's too export oriented. It has to turn inward. But China's model is not a cheap nature model. I don't think that Belt and Road is a cheap nature model. I think it's a political accumulation model. And we see that very clearly with the distinction between its relationship with Africa and the United States and Europe's relationship to Africa today, right? The United States wants to build up AFRICOM and military bases to get ready to fight it out in Africa. And China, of course, is getting ready to respond if it needs to, but its strategy is not a hyper-militarized one. So for the Roman ruling classes in the 5th century, for the feudal ruling classes in the 14th century, they were essentially dealt historic defeats. And there was a golden age in the living standards for workers and peasants. So class struggle doesn't always mean storming the White Palace and hoisting the red flag. Sometimes it does. And in fact, that was a tremendously good move for the working classes of the Soviet Union and, for that matter, for other socialist countries. But the problem that we're facing here is that we are in the midst of what I call the long defeat of the world proletariat. That is a cyclical phenomenon of capitalism. Let us remember that in the 70 to 80 years after 1800 to 1870, the English working class was totally polarized, suffered the most fantastic immiseration you can imagine, and was not a powerful force. The same thing with the United States. It is only towards the end of the 19th century, after a long defeat of the world proletariat, it's only at the end of the 19th century that you get robust working class movements, not just in the Imperial West, but also all across the colonial world as well. You look at South Africa and many other places. So in the present moment, yes, it's not looking good because we're at the end of a long defeat of the world proletariat. And this is going to take a little bit more time to see where the fault lines of the world class struggle are going to take us. Historically, world wars tend to be very bad for ruling classes as well. As we know, the history of 20th century socialist revolutions followed world wars. The impact of the climate crisis, which is now leading to world war, is feeding that. In the United States, you see it where the American working class is absolutely anti-war. It will in no way tolerate another wave of forever wars of Afghanistan, Iraq, and by the way, 170 other foreign military interventions between 1999 and 2019. That's not, that sounds impossible, but that was how many. And so you see that the dynamics of the sort of epical, morbid contradictions of late-stage capitalism are now coming to the fore. But look, I mean, it's hard. You know, you have the propaganda apparatus, the soft power apparatus, coupled with the death squad drone Jakarta method apparatus. All of that coming together has absolutely decimated the world's left. So the objective, and this is an old-fashioned Marxist argument, and I fully own that. The objective conditions for revolution are here, but the political conditions are not. And you could say that's a cop-out, but I don't think it is. I think that there's been a long defeat of the revolutionary forces since roughly 1975, and that will not persist forever. I'm not a dystopian. To believe it would persist forever would involve embracing the 1984 for the majority and Brave New World for the minority as the only possible outcome. I think that's wrong. I think it's very hard to rule by dystopian means. And we saw that during the pandemic lockdowns.
Yeah.
So my name is Jonas. It was only in the passing you mentioned your term you used of biotariat. It's a term a lot of people critiquing your work, and so I would like to know why you use it. Can you explain it, and why not simply use it as part of proletariat? So
that's exactly how I use it.
Yeah, but then why use the term? Because a lot of people take that term and making a Latourian critique, like being
well, a lot of
giving
people are
agents.
intellectually lazy and dishonest too. So that's whoever you hear making that point, you can sort of feel some sympathy for them. Yeah, I mean, my argument has always been very, very clear that the biotariat is not a separate category. That, as you know, because you're smart and you do your homework, you know that much of the spirit of capitalism and the web of life and world ecology takes flight from Marx's account of the working day. That's an account of how the proletariat is a biotariat. That, why is it Marx asked that capitalists work their workers to death? And well, the short answer that he gives very clearly is, well, they can go to Ireland and find fresh workers. They can move to some cheap labor frontier. Well, those cheap labor frontiers are now over. And so often, I think you're really asking me, why do I use that? Because it's a necessary poetics and a point of emphasis to push back against the economic reductionism and the Second International conception of class that is often the point of departure for those so-called critics. So people like Malm, who posture as somehow some far left figure, are in fact adopting the Second International's economic reductionist categories of class, the same economic categories of class that led to socialist parties endorsing war, like Kautsky in 1914 and Bernie, Sheepdog Bernie, endorsing the American support of genocide in Israel. This is the difference with communists. Communists always insist that class is a political, cultural phenomenon, and also, as Marx makes absolutely clear in his foundational conception of class, a socio-ecological and metabolic conception of class.
I am Hestia. I am Hestia. Maybe my question is a bit ignorant. You said that these factors like climate change, environment are determinants, but we're not talking about determinism. I'm not really sure I get why it's not determinant. So.
Well, that elements of the web of life do not directly determine social experience, because we are creative beings. We have consciousness, as we've been talking about with Kalarina. Of course, there are other animals with consciousness as well, but humans have a specific history of conscious cooperation and collective social organization that for about 6,000 years has been shaped decisively by class society. So determinism is not just an intellectual argument. So environmental determinism, biological determinism, genetic determinism, all of those, it's such an important question, so it's not a naive question at all. All of those determinisms are, in fact, politics and reactionary politics of authoritarians. And they use those arguments of genetic determinism, climatic determinism, as justification for imperialist and class strategies. And I fear that some of that has been lost in that recognition of that longer history has been lost. Like Malthusianism is not just a way of describing the world, it's a politics.
Hi again. I'm Pietro. So I'm still digesting the whole.
That's a lot.
Yeah. So I tend to think of cheap measure, your concept, as partly a function of existing technology. But in hearing you today, I came to doubt this notion.
So good.
Am I correct in doubting this? The reason I'm asking is because I tend to think of the possibility of the continuation of capitalism dependent on future technological development that may save it by opening up new avenues for cheap labor.
Well, they've been trying, the neoliberal era has been characterized by a whole series of efforts to resecure a massive enlargement of cheap stuff, cheap information, cheap money, all the rest of it. And it's been spectacularly unsuccessful. I mean, yes, you can look at the G7 where profitability revives after 1983, and then you have different developments around the world. Yes, the neoliberal regime succeeded largely by redistributing power and wealth from the poor and the majority to the rich. It wasn't characterized by a new productivity revolution. So for all of the technological advances in neoliberalism, they failed to do the one thing that all technological revolutions would do, which is to launch a new labor productivity revolution, which brings us to cheap nature. The core of that is labor, is the law of value in Marx's sense. And what's distinctive, I think wholly compatible with Marx, is my argument is that socially necessary labor time and the law of value is fundamentally conditioned and flows through a regime, political and cultural and scientific regimes of socially necessary unpaid work. So that's the other element that I think maybe in my polemics I didn't underscore quite properly enough, although Marx does in the Working Day chapter and elsewhere, that there is a crucial increment of unpaid work, not the unpaid part of the proletarian's working day, but the unpaid work historically provided by, as Maria Mies says, women labor, women nature and colonies. And that the core of the cheap nature thesis is in fact about the organization of work. And that every organization of a proletariat includes necessarily a biotariat and femitariat that is not reductive to extrahuman life, is not reductive to female labor. Because if we did that, we would commit the eco-feminist error, which is to see something essential in female essence, and that's another reactionary program. That these are relations of labor, and that the organization of capitalism depends on not just massive amounts of unpaid work, but a disproportionately rising stream of unpaid work provided by humans and the rest of nature relative to paid work. And that's why the frontier, whenever the frontiers are bountiful and vast amounts of cheap labor, food, energy, and raw materials can be drawn in, what happens? The rate of profit rises. What happens when the rate of profit rises? Investment rises. And then there is a virtuous circle. This happened after World War II, spectacularly. So that's fundamental. I think when we talk about the future of capitalism, so often we narrow our focus to one element. And we should remember capitalism didn't invent science, it didn't invent technology, it didn't invent the proletariat, it didn't invent banking, it didn't invent commodity production. You get the idea. It didn't invent trade. All of those elements, in fact, so much so were to use maybe a problematic term, but certainly all the advanced agrarian empires were animated by a form of proto-capitalism that was never capitalism. Politics was always in control. And that means that we have to really take a more holistic conception of capitalism, not just beyond technology, like you said, but also, for instance, Marxists still refer to the proletarian condition as defined by wage labor. And that's one of the definitions, but the normal state of the proletariat as dependency and Marxist critics across the global south always said is a semi-proletariat. And what does that mean? It means that you have unpaid work and paid work side by side. So we need to look at those, I think in terms of the top, we need to look at the patterns, and then maybe we still want to call it capitalism, maybe we don't, but let's be clear that we are not, moving forward, we are not talking about the capitalism that has existed for centuries. And technology is a part of it, but technology is there because of labor, to organize labor, to advance the productivity of labor.
for one last question. Go ahead.
Okay. So since we're talking about the patterns of the climate crisis, how it undermines the ruling classes and can give this popular revolts, I want to ask you about what breaks the pattern. Nowadays, I would argue, I don't know if that's the case, commerce and trade has a complexity and a global independence that is unparalleled until now. And I would like to know your views on the impact of that, considering that we're talking about patterns and these could quite substantial, I think, challenge that pattern. I'd like to know your views on that.
So this is a question of global interconnection.
Seeing the impacts test on this pattern that you are describing.
Well, one of the symptoms of late neoliberal pathology is deglobalization. I think we're in the midst of a period like that. Globalization is a terrible term. It comes out of Wall Street in the 1970s, but Marx and Engels actually have a better term for this, which is world historical. And the world historical character of the moment is to regionalize interdependence. This is what Trump is trying to do with the United States or in the Western Hemisphere. It's a Western Hemisphere project to stretch from Panama, the Panama Canal, to Greenland, to make sure that the U.S. And not Russia, not China, the U.S. controls the northern sea lanes that are being freed up because of ice. China is pursuing its own form of Belt and Road regionalization. Yes, there's global dependence. We're still in that system, but it's breaking apart, hence the outbreak of the war in Ukraine, which I see really as a war over Belt and Road. So I mean, we can tease that out, but we're also seeing signs of that in the Middle East. War will come more and more. We're in the early stages of World War III, in my view, because of the climate crisis. Is that pessimistic? Well, it's pessimistic in the sense that a lot of people are dying and are going to continue to die. It also intensifies the contradictions of political rule. Wars generally destabilize ruling classes. And so that's I think that's the fate of interdependence in the short term. We'll see what happens in Israel and Gaza. We'll see if the U.S. I mean, Trump has basically laid down the law and said, for now, that could change tomorrow, but said no war with Iran. Iran has hypersonic missiles provided to it by Russia. The U.S. doesn't have those hypersonic missiles. The U.S. cannot fight a war in East Asia. That's absolutely impossible. So we'll see what happens, but clearly we're in the midst of a post-capitalist transition. We'll see what that looks like. But the climate destabilizations will continue. I mean, even as the world deals, I mean, China's already post-peak CO2 emissions, is either now or soon will be post-peak fossil fuel consumption. But the problems of climate change are baked in for a long time, as the climate science tells us. So the contradictions will continue to roil the world. It's a moment of possibility. It's a moment of danger as well.
Okay, so that's somewhat a big note. Let's then thank Jason.
Thank you, everyone.